Hello.
There he
Got
is.
it. We got it. There we go. Okay.
How are you? You're doing all right. I really appreciate what you said about talking philosophy out as opposed to talking about philosophy, because that was always for me. I obviously talking about philosophy is a part of the journey. But you see, often absolutely. What could happen, unfortunately, I always felt like academia, for example, most people who did philosophy and academia, and this is a generalization, obviously, we're not talking about everyone, it always stayed talking about philosophy. Same thing as, can happen with literature, right? Or creative, right? You're always talking about literature, but you're not actually talking literature, which is a very different thing, exactly what you're saying. One of the reasons I was not particularly interested, say, in going into academia or philosophy, theology, all those different things there, because it was always about the subjects, but it never felt like it embodied the subjects, which again, if you talk about philosophy so that, if it's a step to get to the place where then you can talk philosophy, same with writing, same with all these different, well, that's perfectly fine. But unfortunately, for various reasons, cultural incentives, status, you get a job to talk about philosophy, not to talk philosophy, for example.
Yes.
There's a certain, there's been a certain loss of talking philosophy. One of the reasons, as pessimistic as I can get about the world today and new technologies, at the same time, I have been pleasantly surprised at the possibility of YouTube actually being a space where you could talk philosophy or talk literature, where you could actually talk it, which otherwise you could not really ever do in institutions. And therefore you couldn't get in an environment where you could connect with other intellectual people. But it would seem to me like the other thing too, as long as like for me, it's more valuable, say, to meet, say, 500 people, for example, who want to talk philosophy than to have 50,000 people that are interested in talking about philosophy. Now, of course, if you can find 50,000 people that want to talk philosophy, it's not a numbers game. But the issue is, I think there's a lot of good and I think there's a lot of new thought and new literature and different things that actually can be created and found and inspired if you are going to create communities of people talking philosophy or talking creative writing. Because this may sound very strange. I actually believe that communities of people who talk philosophy or talk literature are actually extremely rare. And they've actually been rare throughout history. But when they've occurred, they tend to be the epicenter of the great works and the great ideas.
Absolutely. And this is why I actually, when I was in university, I was getting a philosophy degree, and I never did, because my final paper that I wrote was really just arguing against teaching philosophy, because it was never really, it's philosophy is a dialect. It's not someone standing in front of something and just say what it is. I mean, and this is why, School of Athens and all this, they took off. That's how they taught. It wasn't just like people had that notion that Aristotle just sat in front of a classroom and taught. No, it was all an engagement. Everyone kind of had an equal say. It just so happens that Aristotle was kind of, Plato and Socrates, they were just kind of the biggest names that had the most to say, and rightly so. But it wasn't like how it's taught today, and that is the downfall of the real death of philosophy. It kind of stopped being that once academia took it over and said, here it is. And really essentially what they did was just gave history of philosophy.
That's right.
And then that what just became philosophy was just the history.
Oh, and again, there's a place for that. In the same way that there's a place to learn how to read, but you learn how to read. And it's almost like with philosophy, people are learning how to do philosophy and then never do it. It's like they get the introduction to the terms. It's like literally, it's like people become literate and then never read books is how it feels like.
That's a great way to put it. And that is exactly.
And then of course it becomes kind of pathological, neurotic, and strange. And then it just doesn't function very well. C.S. Lewis had a really interesting essay. It was a very short essay called Meditation in the Tool Shed. And he talked about the difference between looking at a ray of light and looking through a ray of light. So he's in his tool shed and there's a little hole in the roof and there's a ray of light coming down. And he says, you know, when he's standing there, he's looking at the ray of light. But that's very different from stepping into the ray and then looking up through the hole. Now you're looking through the ray of light. And then you see the trees and you see the branches and different things. And what he talks about is very often in life, people confuse looking at the ray of light with looking through the ray of light. And he actually was talking at the time, he was talking about education, really. And, you know, he was saying that the problem is a lot of time education just becomes looking at the ray of light, never through the ray of light.
What's that essay
It's called the A Meditation in a Tool Shed. And I think it's one of Lewis's best. You know, his work on study of words is magnificent. His study on Paradise Lost is magnificent.
Yes.
That is a magnificent. I think it's Discarded Image or something. And the essay, his essay on the inner circle and how that tends to cause violence and different things is really good as well. And that I try to incorporate that into Belonging again. But basically, what ends up happening is, although there's a tragic, you know, there's a lot of screwed up things in the world. One of the things that does give me hope is these communities forming online of people who want to look through the ray of light, not just at the ray of light. Absolutely. And I also wanted to say, though, on your channel, the way you integrate together literature and philosophy and speak together is magnificent, elegant, and desperately needed, because there aren't many people, unfortunately, who teach literature as such, especially not in academia, in my view. So I very much appreciate what you do, because actually, one of the reasons I think a lot of people don't care about literature or read literature is because they've never had, this sounds so strange, but they've actually never heard a real presentation on literature. And they've never heard an actual wrestling with what it's about, how the ideas reflect, how they talk about a bigger story. Most people's experience with literature is they get a worksheet that asks them to name the main characters, the themes, and the symbols. And so literature sucks. And, you know, because if literature is just about filling out a worksheet, then yeah, it sucks. And so the work, that work is very incredibly important. And I very much appreciate what you do on attention in that vein.
Well, thank you. And the reason I do is because of exactly what you just said. I couldn't agree more with that. In fact, and there's so much, and I don't know if this was in one of the 2 videos that Holly put up yet, but maybe in the 3rd one, where I do kind of discuss something like that, and where somebody asks, is it okay? Is it a good thing to is going to university going to help me in writing? And my answer is, well, it does open doors. Because I got a lot of my first publications while I was in university, because I was writing for magazines that the dean had helped me get. So I was like, it will help you in that sense, but it will temporarily kill your creativity. I was never least creative when I was getting my degree in English literature. Oh, sure. I tried writing novels then, and I wrote a few. They'll remain in my closet forever because they're so terrible. They're clearly formulaic. Very much the creativity is just completely, imagination is not there at all. It reads as if an accountant were to have a journal, and it's just terrible. I'm like, what was I was focused so much on you know, the technical aspects that creativity just went away. And so it's good to have those technical aspects. It's just like, oh, it's the same thing very much in music that I see. You know, that's why so many people will, you know, they'll say they'll be like, oh well the Beatles are terrible because, I mean, they're terrible musicians. It's like, well, that's not necessarily true. I will agree they're not great musicians, but there is an artistic value in what, I mean, it's not easy to take 3 chords and write something that's going to get stuck in everyone's head for weeks on end. There's an artistic value that the Beatles have that there's a very good reason why that band has never been repeated throughout history. It's not because they sucked at their instruments. Their art form rested in an emotion that can't be learned. Whereas someone like, say, Eric Clapton, sure, brilliant guitarist, but really anyone could do what he did if they sit down and practice 10 to 15 hours a day for 20 years. You're going to be able to play an Eric Clapton guitar solo. Whereas it does not matter how much time you take in trying to do what the Beatles did, you're probably not going to be able to do it.
Oh,
so
sure.
It's a very different approach. And I mean, if all you have is the technical side, well, then you have a million people that sound like Eric Clapton. And then, but you have no one that has the melodic genius of Lennon and McCartney. And because one of these things is learned, the other is what makes you the artist.
That's very important, because you have this emergent dimension of the artistic creation that is not found in the technicals, and yet the technicals are necessary for that emergent dimension, but it cannot be reduced to it. There's an irreducibility, even if there's a necessity. It's like you would see that, for example. I actually think I'm always interested, say, by, a lot of classical music kind of sucks because it's very technical, but then you get like St. Matthew's Passion by Bach, or some of the violino concertos of Beethoven. And it's like for me, when NPR, for example, has their classical hour, like the music that often plays, it's in the same genre as, say, Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, but it's not even the same thing, because often a lot of classical music feels like it wants to show off its technique. It feels like it wants to show you the notes. And then you get Max Richter's Sleep or Nature of Daylight, and sure, that's called neoclassical, but it's an entirely different ballgame because of an emergent dimension that is very hard to put into words. And that is what you have to talk literature to get, not just talk about literature to do. And that's doing that's hard, because then that becomes about the life. That becomes about the life itself, where, say, the personal story of a Dostoevsky is why the literature has this emergent part of it that you don't find in other writers. But that's something that necessarily is not found in just the technicals, even if the technicals are a necessary part of it. But that's like you said, no, that video you did with Hollywood, you mentioned that was excellent. And don't feel bad, Pae. I have a nice 800-page novel called Usilio that is trash that I wrote over 3 years from college. I have
800
pages called Usilio. And I wrote a 7-book series called The Sword of Tribulation, science fiction, from when I was 10 until I was 21 that I did that. And then I did 1,000-page digressions, and then just tons of short stories and poems. And a lot of it sucks. That's part of the game, right?
I've put together all the complete novels that I have. Nice. 16 of them will never see the light.
Yeah, exactly. That's just part of it.
Four of them, I'm like, I could rework these.
Yeah, no, that's the game. That's the game. I had a large short story collection called Heroes Help. And then I was sending it off to magazines. So I told Holly, I have like 671 rejections from magazines, baby, so that's a 671. I always try to keep out 100. I try to keep out 100 at all times. But, for a long time, you were getting rejected. You didn't know. But then I encountered Robert Butler's book, and it kind of brought up why the novel turned the world. I'd get agents, they say they really, really like it, but, the style's not right. It's choppy, and I couldn't understand why. But then I made these changes, and, you just keep going. You rework works. You say, okay, these 20 will not work, but, these 15 I think I can put together and under the wing, and you start rewriting, and then you start getting publication. Or you get, also people also need to know there could be a difference if you're doing the magazines between, say, a rejection that's just a standard and a high tier where they say, please submit more, or they give you like a long description, because if you start, sure, it really sucks when you get your 4th freaking high tier, but they're telling you to send it directly to the editor. So you're making progress and you keep going it, and that increases your different chances. Like you say, you got, 80% of your work will never see the light of day, but you get that 20 that you can rework, and there can be hopes and dreams and stuff like that. But you got to just keep going.
And then when you're dead, they'll take the 16 they'll take that 80% and just try to make a couple bucks off it.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then for some reason, one of those novels you thought was trash is going to be the one studied in university.
Yeah,
and
that's going to be the great part.
In your grave, you're going to be like, that's a terrible novel.
You'll be like, Eusilio, I didn't even know how to use semicolons. Why is that the one? No, it's funny how that works.
Why did he not use a semicolon here? Why do you think the artistic value of it? And you're sitting there as a ghost, be like, because I didn't know.
Yeah, because I was freaking 18. That's why. Because I was 18. No, it's funny, but yeah, the other thing that's just been neat is just impulsively. I did a lot of philosophy essays and different things with the conflict of mind, reconstructing it, and so on and so forth. But since I didn't have any academic connection, there was nowhere to send anything. So what's been really neat with the YouTube world is it's like, oh, there's a place to just put it and to put it out. And that's been for me really neat because basically, although you can send, say, your poems and your plays and different things to literary magazines, you can't send friggin' philosophy essays anywhere unless you got a PhD. It drives me crazy.
That is was another thing that I argued in my paper, that and why I'd never actually applied for the degree, even though I did all the courses and did all the work. At the end of it, I was like, it's very unethical. Because some of the most I mean, the conflict of mind is a better work than half the most of the papers that are being produced specifically in epistemology today that are just rehashed ideas that but they get published because a piece of paper says, and I think that's terribly wrong. I mean, it wasn't until Kant really in which philosophers were more academic, but I mean, you look at Descartes and all these great huge names, they weren't academics. You know, I mean, you had a few, but most of them weren't. It wasn't really until Kant really pushed that academic, and then it kind of more professor. And now it's evolved to the point where you're only a philosopher if an institution has deemed you as such because you paid enough money to, which is why you get books like The God Delusion, which is just simply a book that asks the question: if God created the universe, who created God?
Yeah,
which if you can't answer that question before you enter Philosophy 101, you probably shouldn't be writing about it.
You know, not to interrupt, but to your point, like, to me, what was always, like, to use that example, you know, if you go to a Nietzsche or you go to Camus, Sartre, or whatever, you know, these people are atheists, but they knew the tradition, right? I mean, they really knew what they were talking about. Absolutely. And whether you agree with them or not, they knew what they were talking about. And they also had a sense of the trade-off. You know, they had a real sense of the tragedy, you know, tragedy meaning trade-off competing goods. They had a sense of it. Absolutely. When you read a lot of, like, if we mentioned the God Delusion, there's not you don't feel a deep wrestling with what you are describing and an understanding of that. And to me, to what you're saying, that was a big problem I had, say, with academic texts or academic papers that I was wrestling. Like, I would read so many academic essays on, say, Foucault, for example, that had no sense of the tragedy of Foucault. The younger Foucault is very liberal. The later Foucault has a kind of conservative sort of like, oh crap, maybe power has a necessary role. And and Foucault is a very fascinating individual in the sense of that wrestling, which brings to mind, say, someone like, well, actually, in many respects, Freud, Foucault makes a Freudian move where Freud in his Civilization and his Discontents is like, well, repressions can cause neurosis, but if you don't have repressions, you get neurosis. Oh, crap, what do we do? You know, a lot of the great thinkers get to that place where there's a double action that's occurring that's very difficult to manage. I never read any academic works of which came to terms with that or saw that at play. And instead, it was, say, just exploring, say, a part of the early Foucault or a part of Foucault, or maybe even the latter Foucault, just simply because that's what their department liked. But there was no exploration of the deep tragedy of Foucault. And by tragedy, this kind of tearing apart where you understand how power can oppress people. Power can be used to manipulate, but then if you get rid of power, people don't have direction and they lose their minds. And then also too, if you completely unleash sexuality, then people actually don't even know what they want to do with their sexuality. And then you get the Eric Fromm and it all gets mixed up. That, I think, actually comes from philosophers not having enough literary training, because literature gives you the mental models of tragedy. It gives you the mental models of the bothness, the doubleness, the sacrifice, where you get one good, but that very good is why you don't get the other good that you want. Literature is full of irony. Irony is a mental model. Irony is very, if you don't understand irony, I don't know if you can actually think deeply, because reality itself has an ironic character in the very phenomenological act. That's your idea by which you know that this is a laptop can never fully capture the frickin' laptop. What you need to understand the world can never fully capture the world, and that's all you have. And it's precisely that model that keeps you from getting to the thing itself in a way, or the fullness of the thing. And yet, without it, you couldn't get to anything. There's a paradoxical, ironic structure that's very going into our very ways of knowing. But in having seemingly the last, I don't know, 3 decades of philosophers not having any training in literature, it would seem, other than enough to reference people so that they can get their glass beads from the Hermann Hesse game. Other than that, they don't have mental models from literature. They don't have an epistemology that is informed by literature. And as a result, the philosophy is not very good. The philosophy is bad because it's not able to meet the actual human condition. And ultimately what happens is philosophy just becomes about, we mentioned this before, it's just trolley problems. That's all it is. It becomes moral thought experiments or talking about why we shouldn't eat animals, which, don't get me wrong, maybe we shouldn't eat animals, but you know, ontology matters.
Which ironically is really great for fiction.
Oh yeah.
Which is okay, which yeah, there's irony in that, and that's really the best place for those kind of like trolley problems. It's primarily science
well, that's
fiction.
Exactly right. That's the kind of joke, is you actually like philosophers who don't have literary training should not be coming up with thought experiments. Like, you know, yes. They really should not. The thought experiment sucks. Give me an Ivan Karamazov who, you know, the very fact that he believes it's wrong to kill children must mean there's a God who doesn't allow everything to be permitted. And yet that means there's a God who allows children to suffer. So turn in your ticket. Give me, you know, that thought experiment, dang it. Yes. You know, give me that one. Don't give me some fat guy getting pushed off to stop a train. But again, that is the horror of when you get philosophy. Well, if all you got to do is talk about philosophy, you don't need literature, right? Yeah. You know, you don't need literary thinking. You don't need the mental models of art because you're just talking about philosophy. To talk philosophy, you're going to need those mental models, especially if you're going to talk about it in a manner that is actually meeting people's lives and where they're at. So, but that, you know, and two, to me, but the very fact you have philosophers now that basically talk about literature as evil, you know, separated apart, and you have literature people that are talking about philosophy is bad, separated apart, that right there goes to show you the radical decline of the institutions. Because obviously philosophy and literature are not the same, but they have an incredibly relevant relationship to one another, because very good literature tends to be the thought experiments of which philosophy needs to be concerned about. The characters of Dostoevsky should be the concerns of philosophers, because if humans like that can exist, what does that mean?
And you know, and well, it used to be that way too.
Yes,
and
that's right.
I mean, it's. I mean, you read some of this. I mean, Nietzsche is just such a great example, because he's often blurs these lines, especially with something like Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Keep talking, Pae. I'm just trying to fix my desk here. Keep talking.
Yeah, definitely. It has more of a well, I mean, it's often argued that Nietzsche was less a philosopher and more just a fiction writer. And there's some people that I've talked to that don't consider him there's some people I've talked to that don't consider him a philosopher. And it's like, well, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I can see their point, especially in his later work, where he does become more. There's more like your typical essay-like structures, like the gay science, and even though it was published posthumously, The Will to Power, even, you know, it is, he did, I mean, the whole aphorisms as a way to express philosophical ideas wasn't something invented by Nietzsche, you know, but it was very prominent, something he very prominently used, and you see this much later on with people like Quran, you know, he with things like the trouble of being born and all. It is philosophy. Is what they're, I mean, by definition, what they're expressing is a philosophical subject in the way in which they live their lives, and they believe, you know, other people should either follow if it's dealing with ethics or whatnot. But in any case, it is philosophy, and you could then take any novel, anything by Kafka, and if you were to take, say, The Trial, and just try and explain it in a few aphorisms, you're going to get Nietzsche. You're going to get not exactly his philosophy, but you're going to get something that would at least on paper resemble something like Nietzsche. You can't do that though with a lot of the modern novels, at least that I've read today. It would be very difficult. Oh, yeah. But because they are just so formulaic and really just to appease the masses that gravitate toward a particular storyline.
Well, a lot of the modern novels don't have that flaming hot white core that really convinces you that they believe that this story, or grasping this story, or getting what this story is pointing at, is a matter of the fate of humanity, dare you say. Yeah. You know, that blazing hot core that's going on.
Yeah, it's almost as and even though fiction always had the element of entertainment, it seems that has become the not only the focus, but really the only thing. The modern novel is equivalent to what sitcoms are today. You know, it's you sit and read one for entertainment purposes, escape reality, and then you go back to work the next day. You never think of it again.
Exactly. Well, a lot of the problem as well is you have a lot of books that want to describe how life is messy and life is hard and life is difficult and it's weird and different things. That's all well and good, and sure, that's true, but there's a big difference between me telling you life is strange and difficult and Ivan Karamazov and Joseph K. showing it at this really deep level, not just, you know, a lot of the stories today, for example, like Sally Rooney or different things, are about family and relationships. They love all the literary fiction loves relationships. And don't get me wrong, relationships are fine. But in some respects, relationships are low-hanging fruit, because everyone is, say, in a family and they have relationship problems. And so there's a sense in which just talking about the difficulty of relationships feels deep, because most of the time you're performing in relationships and you're not directly discussing them. So there's kind of a mask and there's a hiding. So there's a feeling that if you talk about the trauma or the pain of relationship, that's deep, because you're pulling off the mask. And of course, there is a sense in which that is deep. But that is level one deep, for example. That matters. You know, family issues are there in the Brothers Karamazov, but the family issues are just the beginning. And there's much, much deeper ontological stakes. A lot of the literary fiction today has relational stakes, which of course matter. But relational stakes, you have to get to ontological stakes when you're really, really getting at what's going on. Like, and it's one thing to have two people who have different personalities, say, disagree, because one is, you know, I don't know, an INTJ and the other is an ENTP or whatever you want to use, or an Enneagram, whatever. There's a difference between that and then having disagreement between two people because one of them is a hardcore Christian Orthodox and the other is a sensualist Dimitri, and their very frameworks of understanding life are conflicting, and they have to figure out how to get along. Or a Joseph K., whose very way of interpreting life contributes to their capture. You know, that is where you're really getting into the freaking depths of matters. And actually, I would strongly argue that the fact that literary fiction today basically has all of the stakes placed in the realm of relationships, as opposed to like straight up worldviews and ontology, contributes to our inability to handle pluralism, because we come to believe that all disagreement are merely relational, and if we just loved each other more, then we would overcome those differences. No, people are deep at their most fundamental level. Their difference is all the way down, like those turtles, baby. And if you give people the impression that difference is merely relational and personal, and it's not ontological, then people have a false sense of how the world works, and they're not going to be able to deal with the actual depths of difference. And so in some respects, literary fiction today can actually contribute to self-deception, because it gives you a false sense of what you need to worry about. And when that ends up not working, well, then you just call the other guys evil. You know, the other guys must be broken and stupid or backwaters or whatever, and then you get tribalism. So the loss of ontological stakes in literature today. Now, I do understand, you know, obviously we're generalizing. I know there are, you know, texts that can counter this point, but generally speaking, most of the literary fiction, or when I go through Plowshares or whatever, the stakes are relationships. The stakes is personal identity. And of course, that stuff matters. But it's only level one, and if you stay there, you're not really getting at what we need to get at in order to get. But again, the ontological stakes is where the obviousness of the role of philosophy in literature comes out. And if you don't get there and you just stay in the realm of relations, well, then it becomes easy to think that literature and philosophy don't have anything to do with one another. So I think it's a real problem that most literary fiction today, the stakes are merely in the realm of relational, as opposed to relational and ontological. And that's contributing to the problem.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's very, I mean, you see it in most of the shows as well. Well, also one of the reasons all the movies and shows have gone to superheroes is because you can kind of create fake ontological stakes by doing that, by having a different ontological framework. It feels like you're going deep. So there's kind of a running to superheroes as a kind of way to make it appear as if you're dealing with ontological stakes when you're not.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually. Yeah. I never thought of that. Mainly because I just can't stand those kind of movies. It's like, yeah, no, the whole sense of nostalgia, I think, plays.
Yes, that's definitely part of it.
I mean, I did like, you know, Ninja Turtles growing up, but I mean, but I'm not gonna watch a live action of it. I saw it when I was a kid, and that's about all I need of it.
Well, it's interesting because it makes me think about without culture, like an actual engagement with the arts, it's very difficult to have any sort of growing up. And what I mean by that is, like, for an example, there kind of should be a natural point in your life where you stop playing video games. I'm not saying it's terrible if you, you know, like, I guess 2 years ago, my friend, Mr. Sherlin, we were walking by an arcade and I hadn't played Street Fighter in like 10 years and I played it for 5 minutes. It was glorious, but you don't orbit your life around it, right? You know, there's kind of a natural moving out of things where you start saying, okay, yeah, when I was a kid, I did Final Fantasy X and boy, was it glorious, but now we do Dostoevsky. But the thing is, it's almost as if you don't move into the realm of like literature and philosophy, you don't have any developmental sort of, there's no development of taste. And so then you're always just looking back to get back to the Marvel movies. You're always looking back to get to Ninja Turtles. And it's almost like you have 90% of adults, or a very large amount of 20-plus-year-olds or 30-plus-year-olds who have not culturally developed. And so all they have is nostalgia. That's basically all they have. They don't have any taste of any higher or different parts or principles or points of art. It is about nostalgia and it is about action because they were not, say, introduced to art, or say, you know, if they didn't spend their free time when they were 12, say, writing stories, that naturally pulls you along to develop your tastes. And taste kind of sounds subjective, but really it's not merely taste, because in the same way that if you train in martial arts, you literally get better. It is a skill. I actually think it's very important to understand that artistic taste, I guess I use that word again, is a skill. It's not just subjective. It's a skill. It's something you cultivate and you develop. But if no one at school is forcing you to develop that because they're giving you worksheets, and you yourself are not naturally writing stories to force yourself to develop that, and you don't spend your free time thinking about that, then you don't get that skill and you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know if you don't have that skill. It's like everyone's a white belt in artistic martial arts or something like that. Yeah, sure. A white belt is probably better than, some random guy off the street. I would say that the Marvel movies are probably better than Fast and the Furious. Some of them can be. But that's a pretty freaking low bar. D plus is better than D, but it's still a D plus.
And of course, that's a great analogy too, because it's like, well, everyone on the street, a white belt could probably convince someone on the street that they're a black belt.
Yes.
And so the average person on the street wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
That's right.
And it's like, but the black belt most certainly can tell the difference.
And it's so important. Like part of, and this actually is part of the problem of the separation of literature and philosophy. Artistic appreciation is a freaking skill. It is not a taste. I mean, it is a taste in a sense, but it's a skill. I get
what you mean. Yeah,
it's a skill. But here's the thing. You have to be very advanced in the skill of art to get to the place where its connections with philosophy become clear. Like at that high level of skill, you see where philosophy and literature are feeding one another and go on. Well, if a very limited number of people are at that skill, then they don't seem to relate. And so separating them doesn't seem like a big deal. In fact, it seems like the right thing to do, because on the white belt level, they should be separated, because as a white belt, you can't handle doing creative writing and philosophy because it's too difficult not to pour the philosophy in from the top, for example, right? As a white belt, your characters are giving monologues on philosophical ideas. The ideas aren't integrated into the plot, and you're telling instead of showing. But as a black belt, you absolutely know that literature needs ideas. But they need ideas, and ideas are kind of a threat to the story because they always try to eclipse the story. Well, the black belt has the skill to figure out how to do it, how to do both. The white belt, it seems impossible. And so they rationally conclude that it is impossible. And so they separate it. And then you make a bunch of academia and colleges full of white belts who think it's the right thing to separate them. And then it becomes the creed of the day that they should be separated. But actually, that's only rational from a place of white belt skill, per se. Once you get to black belt, you go, oh, frick. Ideas are everything for literature, and literature is critical for philosophy, but they do indeed if they can butt heads, there could be problems. So it's about the skill of conditioning them to work together, but that is a skill. And if people don't have that skill, it will seem like it's not a skill. It'll seem like it's not possible. And so the two get separated, and then we're screwed. Like both of them suffer for it dramatically. Then everyone's just talking about philosophy. They're not talking philosophy, and everyone's doing literature about relations that don't have any ontological stakes. And so everyone watched the Marvel movies, because if philosophy is just about philosophy, who cares? If literature is just about relationships, who cares? Let's just watch Thanos blow up planet Earth or something. That screw up makes space for the monopoly of these the action movies. So it's really critical, I think, to grasp that artistic appreciation is a freaking skill. And we've talked about it as if it's merely, oh, you just like Dostoevsky. Well, I like Marvel, so blah, blah, blah. That'd be like saying, oh, well, I'm a white belt and you're just a black belt, Huh? No, you're talking, there's a difference there.
Yeah. And it's I agree with everything you just said. I think my biggest issue in kind of reconciling exactly where it is I stand on it is more of because even though I agree with everything you just said, I can't find something inherently right, or there's no ought or ought not to when it comes to this that stands out as an outside legislator saying, well, people should do this, right, or they ought to do this. And yeah, at the end of the day, well, especially if your values come from a very materialistic view of the world, you're gonna essentially just ask the question, well, who cares? I mean, if that's something I enjoy, and you want to approach it with a more utilitarian understanding, then and things like this bring more joy than suffering to the world, ethically, what's inherently wrong with doing so? And that's what I can't ever answer. even though I agree with everything you
But this is
said.
really critical, because if you have a jazz improvisation, is there a law that you can say the piano needs to play next? There isn't a law, and yet the piano should play next, and everyone kind of senses it. It can't be put into a hard decree, and yet the piano should be next. But strangely enough, if the saxophone would be next, that would work too. You know, it could be the piano or the saxophone, but it can't be the guitar. Like, why it can't be the guitar? People can hear it. They can sense it. In a jazz improvisation, there's this radical like possibility, and yet it's not the case that just any possibility will do. There is something that's fitting, but it's also a contingent fitting, because if it goes another way, oh, that works too, as long as it comes back to it this way. There's this high order causality and complexity that is going on in a jazz improvisation that can only be known by the musicians in the jazz improvisation, that you could not afterwards, like if you walk down the stage and they're like, hey man, how did you know the piano was supposed to go next with the G note? I just did. Yeah. And yet that person would be right, even though they couldn't quite put it to words. And it actually wouldn't be the case, though, that it had to be the G note. If they would have stayed in that key, it could have worked too, as long as they followed it up with a certain movement. So in a jazz improvisation, there is, in fact, a right and a wrong, but it is a high order right and wrong that cannot be reduced to simple linear cause and effect, of which we're so used to. Art is very much in the business of high order complexity and high order causality, where there is not like a hard decree that says this is what should happen, and yet there is things that are better to do than not to do. But in order to get it, this is what's so hard. Like, could anyone go on stage and join the jazz improvisation? In a sense, and yet not. It's very strange. It looks like anyone could do it because they're just playing these different notes. And in a sense they could, and yet there's a sense they also cannot. So in another way, what ends up happening, like to really get, say, The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, is it the case that anyone could read it? Yeah. But is it the case that anyone could get it? No, because there's a certain level of training that has to occur in order to get The Sound and the Fury, and investment and so on, and willingness to put into it. Does that mean, here's the key, does that mean the person who likes Faulkner is, say, better than a person who doesn't like Faulkner? Well, it's not really about like a moral hierarchy. It's simply the raw facticity of the skill. Is it simply the case that you can't walk up on a stage and join a jazz improvisation unless you've done the training? Yeah, it's just the reality of the fact that you can't walk up on stage and do that. In a sense, that means the person who can walk up and do that is better than the person who cannot in that circumstance. But it's not some sort of moral hierarchy that means the person is better than other people, unless there's a sense in which the inability to, say, do that jazz improvisation somehow has lifelong consequences that affect them in a negative way by not having. And so then you could say it's not that it's better to have that skill hierarchically, but for that person's own sake. And the argument is that actually to have the skill to read, say, Faulkner and to really get that it's better has a high order causality on the way that you perceive and carry yourself in life that is better to have than not. And that's the argument. And that's the case. And you see, if you don't have the ability to, say, really think on the level of high literature or on the level of high philosophy or different things, that does have very real practical impact on your life and how you carry yourself and what you care about and what bothers you, what doesn't bother, what problems you can figure out, what problems you can't figure out. And it is better, I think, safe to say, it is better to have that skill set than not to have that skill set. In the same way that I think it's better to have the skill of being a black belt at martial arts than not to have that skill. But that doesn't mean everyone has to have that skill, or that you'll necessarily even face consequences because you don't have that skill. You know, you could become a black belt and never use it, right? So it's in a sense better to have the skill than not, but it doesn't necessarily follow that you're going to use that skill. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So it's better, and yet it's a contingent better, right? And so it also also goes with artistic skills and all high order complexity skills. And that's a distinction I make in experiencing thinking, and the map is indestructible. So artistic skills are high order skills that can only be understood really in the doing of them. And the reason it's better to have them than not is for your own sake, so that you have skills to engage with the world that are better than not. But you can't even necessarily say that you'll use them because, you know, because of you may get black belt skills and you never use them. And yet at the same time, I've never had to beat up somebody with my wushu staff. I've never had to do that. I've never had to and yet I feel in a way that's hard to explain that I'm better to have that skill than not, even though I haven't used it directly, because there's something about how it makes you feel safe. You know, you feel okay to be on the street. You feel okay. In the same way, when you have artistic skills, you can't necessarily always say, put your finger on how you're using it, and yet you have a sense that you do. But it's really difficult to get that unless you have the skill, in the same way that it's really difficult to get why a certain note should play at a certain time in a jazz improvisation, and yet you fully get it when you have that skill and you're in that situation and you do it. So I think understanding the benefits of these artistic apprehensions, these high order apprehensions in those terms is critical, as opposed to some sort of oh, there's some law written on a tablet in the universe that says Faulkner is better than the Marvel movies or something.
Yeah, there's a kind of a simple a priori understanding, in the sense that like you were saying about the book, you don't necessarily have to use it, but if it being there it's almost a very useful tautology in action. It's
absolutely.
I guess, yeah. I mean, that I can understand. Despite their, but here the thing is, even if that's true, you don't need that anywhere written down in stone that, you know, Faulkner's better than, or even despite us just simply knowing that is true, is there anything necessarily outside that still makes it, again, I don't want to resort to the moral hierarchy kind of, but is that, if say society as a whole just got rid of this higher understanding of art, just like overnight, snap your fingers, it's gone. Is there anything that would provide one to then look back and say, well, we shouldn't do that? Now, of course, you know, Nietzsche would one that would say yes, as he thought society itself, if the first thing to go in a society that's crumbling is art. Yes. And I think art holds so much historical value in understanding culture, and what it is arguably the primary way of doing so. So it makes sense that you get rid of that. So, but at the same time, you go, well, you know, is there anything outside us just simply not wanting that to happen that says we shouldn't want that to happen? But I mean, and that's what I don't know. I mean, yes, of course, society progressing is we look at review as a good thing. But if we don't, and we digress back into, you know, well, what is the overarching, you know, say that, well, we shouldn't do that. Why can't we just all be comfortable at the lowest form? We all die happy, nothing happens after that. Who cares? And it's like, well, I guess really there's nothing that says that.
Oh,
this
is marvelous. My good friend Bernard, we wanted to do something where we went around Charlottesville and basically removed all art or anything that had any artistic principles for like a day from the city or a certain area, so that people could get a sense of how like omnipresent art was in their lives, to the point where it seemed like it wasn't there at all. Because there is this funny part where,
there's colors, right? There's shapes, there's design, basically all of phenomenological experience is aesthetic. There is a certain aesthetic principle to it. So the question becomes, what's the difference between, say, art and aesthetic? Are they different in kind or simply different in degree, right? If we're like talking about, we're going to remove art from society and see what occurs, would that be a removal of the paint on the wall? Would that be a removal of any colors and everything? Or is there something where, say, the bookshelf right here that's made of wood and so on and so, some people consider bookshelves their art, right? So would a world where we got rid of all high art, for example, or just all art, we said, would the bookshelf go? Or would it not because it's functional, right? Or would all there be is a bunch of, say, monochrome shelves over there that have no aesthetic pleasure in any way whatsoever still be there? But there would be shapes. Are shapes artistic? When do shapes cease being artistic, aesthetic and becomes art? So it becomes very interesting where the question becomes, is Faulkner, say, different from the bookshelf in kind or is different in degree? Is Faulkner different in kind from the Marvel movies or different in degree? And if we say different in degree, well, then it would actually kind of be fair to rank them, right? Because they actually share similarity of form by which you could then say, okay, Faulkner meets the form of the point of art better than the Marvel movies. But then, of course, that'd be teleology and you'd have to define, final calls or different things like that. But what's interesting is if we start to go, well, actually Faulkner and the Marvel movies are the same in kind, they just differ in degree, then you can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other, right? You would actually be making a sort of judgment of which you should, please.
Well, what's so great about that point and the experiment you were discussing of removing all art, what's so great about the connecting that point with that experiment itself is doing an experiment like that is impossible for the very act that doing that is an artistic endeavor.
Exactly.
So you really couldn't purposefully do it.
No, you can't.
That would go maybe what I'm getting at on is there actually something that says, because the thing that's saying this is actually ontological. It's something that is just in us, that's part, and it is, if there is a universal kind of nature, it is simply this, and to do anything against this would be to go against nature and therefore arguably not human to begin with.
Exactly. That you just cut right to the chase, because ultimately what we can get at is that the removal of art would be the removal of the human. It would actually be a retardation of ontology itself. And another way to kind of just make this point that I always love, and so here's the thing. Okay, if and just as a quick, let me put the point I was about to say. G.K. Chesterton in his book Everlasting Man, it opens with this wonderful story that I love on cavemen, and he's like, so what do you think about when you think about a caveman? It's like someone running in the fields, killing people with killing buffalo with a spear or whatever. He's like, yeah, that's what you think, right? Because that's what you taught. You know what cavemen seem to have loved to spend all their time doing? Freaking drawing. Look at all the cave art. Look at all the paintings. And the point that Chesterton is making is you always hear about Rousseau, state of nature, Hobbes, state of nature, Paradise or Brutus, but you never hear about the cavemen or the state of nature being where everyone is an artist. But we have just as much reason to think that prehistoric man is an artist as we do to think that he's some uncivilized brute. Because look at all the freaking paint. There is no civilization that doesn't have art. Yet we never think about art being essential, at the very root of human beings. We always think about art coming later. Once we got our, once we got our food, once we got our agriculture, once we got our roads, then we were able to go to the art galleries. Art always comes across to us as later in civilizational development. And what G.K. Chesterton, he's from that age where they're all very literary, like Oscar Wilde and Yeats, and they're hilarious and they're wise, and it's, they're that level of genius. You're like, oh, okay.
Okay, I'll put this down and not try anything ever again.
Yeah, right. It's like, oh, okay. And, he's just making the point that he's like, guys, we got to start realizing that humans in a state of nature is an artist. I mean, it's right there. It's all in the case. And so to me, what that story is so important because it's pointing to exactly what we're getting at is that a world that didn't have art would actually not include the human, because it is literally impossible not to have aesthetics part of all phenomenological experience. And there is very good reason to believe that human beings, when left at their most prehistoric state, freaking paint. And so it's essential to us. And so therefore, if Marvel and Faulkner are different in degree, not in kind, then it could be the case that the difference lies in the cultivation of the artistic ability to fully apprehend the project. And if there's something about art that is essential to human beings, then the better you can carry out that apprehension, the better you might be at being human. And we would have reason to think that was the case based on the fact cavemen like to paint, based on the fact that we seem to, here's the other kind of axiom, we as human beings do not seem to right out of the womb or as toddlers know what's good for us. There is reason to think that what we naturally like to do is the easy, is the simple, and the instantaneous gratification. Human beings seem to like to do that. And we tend to understand that that's not good. We tend to understand, although you cannot claim that everything hard is good, it does seem to be the case that a lot of things that are best entail some degree of training. Well, based on that axiom, which is based on experience, it's not in a void, it's based on how human beings seem to actually be, there would be reason to think that the cultivation of the ability to appreciate Faulkner is better than the ability to like Marvel, precisely because of the necessity of the cultivation of which, from experience, we know is better to get than not in other areas of life. So why would it not be better to get in this area of life? And we have reason to think that's worth pursuing based on the fact that all phenomenological experience is aesthetic, and because humans in their most prehistoric state are freaking artists. And based on those grounds, I think it is valid to say that Faulkner is better than Marvel.
Yeah, that I think is the closest I'll get to answering that question. No, I think that's dead on too. I agree with that. Because there is that initial understanding that we just tend to naturally have, and it's funny too, because and to further that point, even if let's say I'm not a fan of Eric Clapton. I brought him up earlier. You know, he's and I'm not the big. I find him quite boring, but the thing is I can still recognize he's a much better guitarist than most others. There's a lot of novels that I can recognize as better than others that I just didn't get along with, and this would allude to the fact that we do in us have that artistic higher understanding of a goal, or that's directed or seemingly directed toward a goal, maybe not an end goal, but I mean a kind of an everlasting ongoing pursuit. And that's why we can recognize some art better than other art, even if we do not typically like that art.
Well, you know, in the same way that we cannot assume that just because something is hard is good, even though the best things may also be hard, we also cannot assume that cultivation is always good, because we could theoretically cultivate our taste to something that is bad. Well, that would require discernment, right? It would require discernment on what cultivation is good, what difficulty is good is from not. Oh, wait a minute. That means you have to get philosophy. You can't even do art without philosophy, because you can't cultivate discernment in order to figure out how to discern, to ask philosophical and epistemological questions by which you can go about that, so you can know which artistic skills are worth cultivating and which are not. Oh, well, it seems like philosophy and literature have a lot to do with one another. So you have to have the inquiring mind, which is what philosophy, last time I checked, was supposed to help cultivate, in order to actually be able to identify if X is worth cultivating or not.
Is X a skill or is it merely a taste? Because there is such thing as taste. And sure, all skill involves a level of taste, but cannot be reduced to taste. Well, in order to tell which is which skill is reducible to taste and what is not reducible to taste, that would require discernment. And that would require philosophical cultivation. And so this, again, is why philosophy and literature, philosophy and art are so deeply connected, because you always are you're always trying to figure out how to cultivate the artistic man, per se, the artistic person. Well, that means you always have to be checking with philosophy. It's like philosophy is your guide. You're like, you're journeying through the life of being a human, which is to be creative, if we follow G.K. Chesterton. And you're always like, am I going the right way? Well, you got to look, you're handmade of philosophy. Well, let me ask philosophy. Am I going the right way? I don't know, man. Maybe go right. Okay. And you go this way and you're like, I don't know. Is Sally Rooney good or not? Let me ask philosophy. It's like, oh, well, she's better than most. But, relationships, you got to get to those ontological states. So you always have to have your kind of freaking Virgil as you're going through the dark woods of philosophy in order to know that you are embarking in the creative act and being of the human successfully in the correct way. So that, to me, is why philosophy and art go together so much.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So I think that definitely answers the why it is. You could easily put what you're saying under a moral hierarchy if you're defining an ethical pursuit in which progresses us toward this kind of everlasting goal we were discussing. So that I think answers that. I think it what I was let's
no, and just to add, if humans are ontologically artists and there are things that make them better artists than not, the things that make them better artists are arguably morally better. They are more fitting. They are more right for the human as the human than things that do not. So you can absolutely bring a moral hierarchy that is not comparative to say others, or that's teleological, but is based on the ontological reality of human as artists and based on the phenomenological experience of aesthetics, that everything is an aesthetic experience. And so there would be grounds for an ethic or a justified claim that something is better than something else, which would be a kind of moral hierarchy.
It's funny, I was just reading this morning, I was reading Kant's a theory in the transcendent aesthetic, and Kant's all about synthesizing everything.
Yes,
just everything just comes, which makes sense. I mean, a lot of what he has. Sure, there's problems with his theory of time and space, but yeah, you definitely see where he's coming from. Actually, the book that I'm reading right now is one called Kant's First Critique by Cazier, H.W. Cazier. Have you
not
heard
familiar?
that name?
It's a good book.
I've just started it. Just read the first 40 pages. It is fantastic.
Wow.
It is.
Let me see the name again.
Yeah, it's just called Kant's First Critique. The last name is spelled Cassirer.
Excellent.
And so far within these 40 pages, he's actually doing so. I haven't heard anyone do well, and that is just completely tear down a lot of Kant's ideas in regard to space and time, which I've always heard the few problems with it, but he does so in such a way, using Kant's own critique and showing where he contradicts. And it's great. It's one of the best. Like I said, I'm only 40 pages in, and it's already one of the best critiques of Kant's work that I've read.
Well, I wrote that down. I'll have to give that a look.
You'll like it if you're interested in. Well, of course, you're interested in Kant. I guess so. I don't think you could study philosophy and just not study Kant. But
oh yeah, well, it's another subject, but I think it is very problematic. I know one cannot help when reading Kant to say focus on the first critique versus the second critique, or so on and so forth. But
I am a believer, and I would have to write it out, that the three critiques are all in conversation with one another, and that they are building in very important ways. And if you separate the critique of pure reason from the critique of judgment, for example, and of practical reason, that's going to that's going to throw off an understanding of Kant's overall project, in my opinion.
Absolutely. The first time I read Critique of Pure Reason, I thought I was getting enough out of it. It wasn't actually until I read Critique of Practical Reason, which is, in comparison, a bit easier. But the funny thing is then when I've gone back to reread Critique of Pure Reason, it really does come together in ways that you almost can't say you've read Critique of Pure Reason unless you've read the three critiques.
I have not done the research. I would be very surprised
If Kant actually did not have his overall arch in mind from the very beginning. I'm not sure. I feel like he did, because it's just what you said. A lot of the first, the Critique of Pure Reason really comes out after you read the later works. And that to me is someone who they have the whole thing together, and so you don't really get it unless you get the whole thing. That's just
I think you're right, because there was before he wrote Critique of Pure Reason, there was a 10-year period in which he wrote nothing and published nothing, and when asked, he said he was thinking about these ideas.
Yes.
So I think within 10 years, someone like Kant, giving him 10 years to think of he more than likely had the whole thing planned out. It really does make more sense, unless it was just such a happy coincidence that his later thinking, and by later, it wasn't that these things were hugely separated apart.
Sure.
They were all quite one after the other, and so it would be a very happy coincidence that he just later thought, well, this works very well with this over here.
I think in the same way, you probably, you'll see some people will take the Bible, for example, and they'll do a hypertextual map, or so there are references to like the Old Testament and Revelation. They'll do it, and there's all these threads, and it all connects, and it's rather extraordinary when basically, every section of the Bible is in communication with 30 other sections. I will venture to say, I think there's probably, you could do a hypertextual map on Kant across his critiques, where actually you go, oh wait, this phrase is from this, oh wait, that's connected, and you could do kind of a hypertextual map, because it feels as if it's almost just language, right? You say first critique, second critique, third critique, as if they're not it's almost like one critique of the human, it's like a continual thing with different emphasis at different times. Because for David Hume, he's making an incredibly profound point that rationality is an internally consistent system that cannot justify itself. It must always point to something non-rational, is the term I like to use, not irrational, something outside of the bounds of rationality to ground it, whether it be sentiment, community, and so on and so forth. So David Hume is terribly misread, so I spent a lot of time trying to do it. I just finished, you were mentioning Descartes. It's funny you mentioned that, because another theologian who actually I think is very philosophically significant is Anselm. Everyone talks about the ontological argument, very similar. So the ontological argument is the idea that, God is the greatest of all possible beings. A being that exists is greater than one that does not. Therefore, God exists. And everyone kind of laughs and they say, "Oh, okay."
The rebuttal that I always hear is, well, I can think of a perfect island. Doesn't mean it. It's like, it's a bit more than. Sorry.
No, it's very important what you're saying. The ontological argument is section 2 of about 20 in the Prosologia. It is not even close to the beginning of the argument, and it is very important, because section 3 is actually more important. It's not called the ontological argument. Anselm never called it that. It's more like the ontological structuring of what the concept of God, if it is meaningful, must be. The concept of God can only be thought of as real. Otherwise, you're not thinking about God, but it's possible the concept does not correspond with anything. So actually, even though the concept of God is completely internally consistent in its very reality, it would not necessarily mean that it corresponds, even if it's coherent. So what you actually get in Anselm is a stupidly profound revelation on epistemology. Anyone, even like hardcore Christian apologetics, are on like, you guys should be on this. They're not on it at all.
It's so weird because
weird.
When you hear something like that, that reminds me of going back to the Cogito too. When people, I wrote a paper on this because I think it's again one of the most misunderstood things in philosophy altogether. I don't know where this originated. I've searched and I found one place where it's written down where it might have come from again, a theologian, R.C. Sproul. I don't know if he wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Consequence of Ideas,
yes,
in which he states this. And this is the only place I can find where this argument is, where he states the Cogito as being victim, I guess, to the law of non-contradiction, and is therefore circular. Now, there can be an argument made for this if you put the Cogito in a syllogism, like an Aristotelian syllogism. But the thing is, Descartes never does that. He never said, I think, therefore I am. And he purposely didn't because of that problem.
Yes.
And so, no, Descartes' argument in the Cogito is not circular. And though I hear people say that all the time, and I just want to sit there and be, do you really think one of the most brilliant minds in philosophy just missed this obvious point? And so I hear that so much, it drove me insane that in one of my long essays I've been working on forever, I mention it in the introduction to that. And I just point out every single thing why this is not true.
What Anselm is doing, and what Descartes is actually quite inspired by Anselm. So I was revisiting Descartes because Anselm starts off his proslogia sort of from a state of meditation. And he wants to basically say, if you're thinking about the concept of God, what must you be doing? And people think that Anselm is engaged in a kind of foundationalism. And that's also what they do with Descartes. They think he's looking for a foundationalism, but we're talking about a meditation. A meditation is the nature of thought in its coherence to itself. Doesn't necessarily correspond. That's a different question. It's an exploration of how rationality structures itself to itself in order to justify itself, even if ultimately that justification does not ground itself. And so, a meditation, so for Anselm, the only way you ever think about God is from your knees, right? So if you're not meeting the condition of being on your knees, then you're not actually thinking about God, which then would say that there's a certain way you have to condition yourself and open yourself up to even begin to think about God.
Right.
That does not necessarily. So what he wants to tell you is if you even want to begin theology, you can only meaningfully begin theology from a place of which you assume the concept that you are referring to is the greatest of all possible beings. And that being must be real, because if it's not real, you're not thinking about it. And so that is the orientation of the argument and what follows from there. It's just the freaking groundwork, for frick's sake. It's just the nature of the rest. And that's just an example where School of Life and all that is so bad.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. They give groundwork and then send someone off, and that person they just sent off will never actually read it. And why would they? They were just told what it all means. Why waste time then reading it?
It's consequential because, like,
For example, if you're never going to read Anselm, you're never going to read, say, Descartes, because you're like, them. Right. And you think you know them. And also, you are led into and honestly, a lot of this gets into why, like, the epistemology work I do and the conflict, all these different things, because there's this whole world of epistemology that is actually missed because you start to think that you have some possibility in these epistemologies of foundationalism, when really this is a groundwork that wants to suggest a necessary posture to even begin the inquiry, which the fact then that inquiries have to be postured to begin says something about the relation to action and thought, and that you cannot totally separate them. And that would get into the Scottish Enlightenment, David and Hume, and how thought has to be embedded to even be possible. It has to be in reference to a non-rationality to condition it. Well, that would change the entire nature of debate now, wouldn't it, in your political order? Because if all thought has to be conditioned, then you have to debate, keeping in mind this is the difference between axioms between the people discussing, which if you don't even know if that's going on, well, the debate is doomed, of course, and then you get tribalism. So misreading these texts have massive practical consequences for how people carry themselves.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and that's a more important danger for sure. Another danger I find with things like this is it plays into the problems of academia.
Yes.
It like this is how you end up with a whole entire book asking the question, well, if God created everything, who created the universe?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, well, Aquinas answered that in a letter, over 700 years ago.
Yes.
We don't ask that, and that his answer still holds true. It still makes sense. It's a semantic game at the end of the day. But for people that got educated got their YouTube degree here by people that got their degree in academia, we suddenly have a huge problem because suddenly that degree they get from YouTube given to the people that got their degree from real institutions they're doing it the way they were taught, which kind of just you go down the ladder and done this down.
For me, I always took seriously this notion that mediums, like you can't simply turn a novel into a movie, for example. I mean, you can, but something is lost. Mediums should bring with them transformation.
You can't take the essence of a novel and put it in.
That's correct. And so mediums there should be something new when there's a new medium, in my view. There should be. And for me, I did not like seeing simply academia translated to YouTube, where it was just, we're just going to have academic lectures on YouTube, which fine. If it's introduction, that's fine.
Yeah.
To me, I guess I've wanted something kind of new, like a new kind of philosophical engagement or literary engagement. And that's why people like you, Daniel Zaruba, Guy Senstock, Dawood, and what we do, to me is exciting, because that is a new kind of engagement that YouTube makes possible. And to me, that should be what's happening, because YouTube is a new medium. Especially now, you can say, but it's like 10 years old or whatever, well, you didn't have fast enough internet for lots of people to do it. You didn't have the video technology. It is relatively new, the ability to actually have these intellectual discourses or ways of doing things on YouTube. So for me, I guess I did not want to, I very intentionally avoided YouTube videos about what Marx said in the Capitol, what Descartes said, or different things. And
it's I can't stress enough how important it is to before watching anything on YouTube in regard to at least get a basic understanding it yourself. And that might involve simply just secondary text. But I know, like, at least for me, whenever I read secondary text, I always make sure I run them by this philosophy professor. I know, like, what do you think of because I trust him enough. I've known him for 10 plus years.
Wow.
He has the same problems with that. That's why he retired. Actually, he's retired now, and he has the exact same issue that we were discussing. This isn't philosophy. It's like, I have no problem teaching history, but you can't teach philosophy.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean people can't learn philosophy.
Sure.
Obviously. But you can't teach it as if it's a history. And so he was getting fed up with the way the academics work. And it's like, yeah, I'm done with this. And so when you're going to read even secondary sources, you kind of also have to make sure these secondary sources are reliable.
Absolutely.
And I don't expect anyone to jump into Being in Time and understand it.
Sure.
No one's going to jump into Hegel and understand it. No one's going to understand Hegel, period. But it's I have a hard time with Hegel. The bits
Anyone
that I
who
do.
says they don't is lying.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's the thing, is that so many of these channels pretend they understand Hegel. It's like, no, unless you're Zeke, I don't believe you. I don't. There's certain concepts that I understand and get, but as soon as I open up phenomenology of spirit, I go, suddenly I just forget the English language altogether. So I am a strong believer in secondary sources.
Sure.
Those secondary sources have to be real secondary sources.
Yes.
School of Life is not a secondary source.
No.
They're at best an eighth source.
An eighth source.
So it's like that's the thing. Anyone that wants to learn philosophy, I'll say, well, engage with philosophers, people that for a while.
Yes.
And don't just jump on the internet and listen to things, because you're never going to learn it that way. No. There are some great channels like yours, but you can't just jump right on your channel and then understand what you're talking about. You can't.
It's very similar to what we're saying about the skill of artistic appreciation. You just simply cannot jump into Faulkner, not because it's nonsense, but because of the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
It has to be that way. You can't just do black belt. You can't just cook like a French chef. That's not because you're a bad person or you're lesser.
And that's the thing I want to stress too. Whenever I tell someone that, I think it's like, I'm not saying you're stupid, because you're not. This is like, you can't go to France without learning French and expect you're going to know what they're talking about.
Yes.
That doesn't, because you just don't automatically know a language doesn't mean you're stupid. You're not going to know something if you've never been told it. You don't just wake up one day knowing philosophy. It's a language that takes time to learn, and the amount of books that I read, put down, and got nothing from it took years before I went back, picked them up, and went, oh, I understand what they're saying now.
I think one of the great horrors, great horrors, but one of the great problems is we think of intelligence not as a skill. We think of it as something you are or something you have. No one has karate. Nobody has singing. You might have a propensity to sing. No one has operatic parody ability to sing. No, not even Pavarotti did. He had to train. You may, like you say, some people may have a natural proclivity to say art, but no one has the skill of art. Intelligent, some people perhaps has a proclivity to abstract reasoning. Nobody has the skill of abstract reasoning. You gain the abstract skill. This is the big mistake. We conflate a proclivity to say kinetic intelligence, emotional intelligence, blah, 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 with having the skill of emotional intelligence, the proclivity to abstract reasoning with having the skill of abstract reasoning. There must be a division between proclivity and skill. That doesn't exist. People either think you have abstract reasoning or you do not. And therefore, if you tell someone you have to train to understand being and nothingness, the only way they can interpret that is you saying they're dumb, that they don't have the ability. But when you understand it metaphorically as a skill, because it is a skill, intelligence, IQ, is one of the most worthless notions out there, because it's well documented. It's past 110. Okay, there is a correlation between success up to 110 IQ. After that, it's a wild west. You know, the thing that matters is grit, basically, and hard work and continual, doing, the continual compounding, like we talked about the other day. IQ, actually, you know what's funny? You get your IQ, you can actually have people like high IQ correlates with failure because you can't relate. You're overwhelmed by abstract patterns. So IQ is stupid. Like it's just stupid. It's dumb to emphasize. What matters is skill, the cultivation of skill. Philosophy is a skill. Art is a skill. Reading is a skill. All of it is a skill. We don't have a society that thinks in terms of skills and hobbies or arts, because art means skill. We don't have a society that thinks of that. We have a society that thinks in terms of personality. You have a personality that likes philosophy. You have a personality that likes to read. You have a personality that likes art. I don't have that personality, so we're just different. And don't get me wrong, there's space for difference. But we're taking a desire to kind of say everyone is different and that's okay, to an extent where there's no skills.
Yeah.
And that's when you get a mediocre society. That's when you get a society in decline. And that's where you go too far. Absolutely, everyone in a human dignity sense is equally valuable. Everyone ontologically has an equal value, but not all skill development is equal. And in the desire to treat people as if they're all in inherent dignity, they're all inherent dignity, we've taken all difference and made it a matter of personality and personal propensity, removed any thinking and skill. And as a result, the society does not develop all the artistic crafts and philosophical crafts we've talked about, of which there's reason to think will lead to a humanity that's less human based on the G.K. Chesterton and all that. And worse yet, if you don't have that skill, you also don't have the ability to tell you don't have that skill. And so it's a Kierkegaardian total despair. When you're in total despair, you don't know you're in despair. So really the horror of this mistake of not having categories of skill in our thinking is we lose the ability to even tell that we're in decline. And so you're declining and can't even tell you're in decline. And that's a very severe problem.
It's a very, very almost aggressive form of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Absolutely.
It's one that's not just something that is within it's one that almost builds larger as it goes.
Absolutely.
It's not just you just don't know what you don't know. It's that you almost begin to know less the more you kind of realize. It's like Oscar Wilde's line, "I'm not young enough to know everything." It's the more you study philosophy and science, or even Heisenberg in his philosophy and physics, I think has a really great line. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but I think it can apply even outside a religious context, where he says, people that study a little bit of science will be an atheist. People that study a lot of science won't. And it's like we've come to this point where we just study a little bit of everything.
Yes.
And so we're missing a whole huge part of and that huge part doesn't just change our view. It shows that our views are in complete opposition to what it actually is. It's not just if I just know a little bit more, then I'm adding on to what I know. No, it's you're going to realize that you actually didn't know anything. And it's actually the opposite of what you believe, because you believe that.
What you're getting at is really important. I think there's a very real sense in which it's almost better to be stupid than kind of college smart. Because college smart, now being stupid is worse than being intellectually skilled, as we're describing. But there's a real sense in which the middle is the worst, because the middle is where you believe you're at the end and you don't have the humility of knowing that you're not at the start.
Yes.
And so that's really bad. What you're describing requires the trauma of facing that you don't know anything. And it's much better just to quote Socrates saying that he knew nothing and acting like you really believe it, as opposed to going through the work of getting to the place where you feel it. You have to read. You can know that you don't know anything, but until you read a lot of books, you don't feel that you don't know anything. And until you feel that you don't know anything, you can't begin to know something. But that requires, it's such a counterintuitive idea that you have to work hard to feel that you don't know anything so that you can begin to move in the direction of groping out something, that it's it's in a sense traumatic to use. It's very, very difficult. And any way that you can avoid doing that, you're going to love, such as School of Life videos, such as lame YouTube videos that will make you feel like you don't need to do that because you're smart.
It just ensures ignorance by way of saying you know what you're talking about.
That's
And,
right.
and you're right that middle ground really is where you can see how dangerous doing that is in play right now in the United States, where college students are so the interpretation of Derrida these days by who I hear college students is what they say, and all of postmodernism in general, and someone like Jordan Peterson, who I don't really have anything against.
Sure, but his
ideas of postmodernism are taken from these students that also have no clue who Derrida even. Well, it's like I've heard Jordan Peterson say the fall of Western society is because of Derrida and Foucault.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, first of all, you're giving these two guys way too much credit. I mean, I think they're absolutely brilliant, but there's a very small fraction of people that even know who these people are. There's even a smaller fraction that understand who these people are. And we're talking about misunderstood philosophers. Well, in my opinion, the most misunderstood philosopher to ever live was Derrida. I mean, Derrida was just so absolutely brilliant, but he's been dumbed down to this deconstruction is destruction, and therefore to get a better society we have to tear down he's been rolling in his grave over and over, hearing people say these kind of things.
Well, one of the great jokes with Jordan Peterson on that is that actually Derrida could be used to make a lot of the cases he wants to make. Like Derrida
and that is so I was just pacing my apartment back and forth, having a conversation with myself before this, saying that if Peterson knew what he was his misunderstandings of Nietzsche, he would quickly realize that Nietzsche, because he loves Nietzsche or claims to, but he's not connecting that Nietzsche was a postmodernist. I mean, he was more in line with postmodern than he thinks he is. And if Jordan Peterson understood postmodernism, he would quickly see that.
Yes.
But for some reason, he just takes on what the university student, where they're, I guess, well, from the academics, it's like, how did they misinterpret Derrida so badly? It has potential to destroy a society. It's like that is dangerous. And that's why, philosophy isn't for everyone, and especially not those that are not willing to put in the work in which it takes to learn the skill. And if you don't learn it's going back to the white belt. It's if you think the white belt is the highest belt you're going to get, when you're thrown in a ring with a bunch of people that have a black belt, you're not making it out of that ring in one piece. And you're going to go, wow, what just happened? And then it's too late.
Oh, and that's where we're screwing up, because when you get this kind of mediocre thing, like the very moment of the revelation of the mediocrity of that intelligence can be the moment where it's too late. And to go back, that's the horror of it. To me, that's what's happening right now in economics. I am of the opinion that there was a good 2 decades where people were warning about what would occur when it was. So to make a long story short, there was a lot of people who were arguing that national debt, for example, doesn't matter until it does. And then when it does, it's too late. And they were warning that, a lot of the modern monetary theory people said you don't need to worry about national debt. You only have to worry about inflation. And in a sense, that's true. If you could theoretically run up $100 trillion in debt and inflation never occurred, it wouldn't matter. So they had a point. Here's the problem. When inflation does rear its head, you no longer have any wiggle space because of your national debt to address the inflation. So the issue is that when national debt becomes a problem, it can be fatal. Like there's no gradual, it's like doom. And so national debt is a thing that goes from not being a problem at all and entirely irrelevant to being fatal, and just like that. So the point I'm just getting at is the moment that unveils that your economic modeling did not work is kind of when you're already past a point of no return. So likewise, you kind of recognize points of no return past them. So likewise, you realize the horrors of mediocre intelligence at the point when it's revealed that it's mediocre, but then the consequences are set in. And so it's kind of like, until you have a heart attack, you have no reason to think that you need to exercise. Until you are obese, you have no reason to think you need to eat better. But then once you do, well, now you have heart problems, right? That's also another reason, actually, pointing back to our earlier point. And I'm noted. I can literally talk to you all night. I love you very much. You're so great. But to talk back on another thing, one of the reasons also it's so easy to think artistic skills do not matter is because when they work, you do not see the crisis that they prevented. So, for example, if you exercise or you eat well and you never get a heart attack, you never see the heart attack you don't get, right? Well, unfortunately, that means you can always think you didn't need to exercise because you never see the heart attack you don't get. So you could always think, in an alternative world, I could have saved all that time exercising and eating right because I never had a heart attack. What a waste of time. No. The reason you didn't have a heart attack is because you did that exercise.
Right.
It's actually very similar to artistic abilities, intellectual abilities. The very fact that you avoid, say, all the drama or the misunderstanding or getting sucked into politics that a lot of people who lack those skills do is evidence that those skills are working. But you never see the world that would have happened had you not had those skills. So you can always wonder if you wasted your time. Because a lot of the intellectual skills and artistic cultivations are preventative measures, not reactionary measures. Well, reactionary measures have an advantage of having a thing they're reacting against to validate their existence, where preventative measures always can wonder if they prevented anything because you never see the thing that's prevented. So that's another reason why intellectual skill, as opposed to intellectual status, artistic skill, as opposed to just glass bead games you can play at cocktail parties involving the books you read, that's why they tend to take over. And actually, that's also, it's another topic, but that's also a reason why generally societies tend to have cycles of decline, because the reason that societies can avoid the cycles of decline tend to be preventative measures that cannot validate their existence precisely because they work and you don't see the thing that's prevented. And so then there's a segment of the society that thinks it's not needed. So then they vote accordingly. And then once it appears, it's too late.
I hear you talk about these things, and I can't help but think that Plato was definitely onto something when he was discussing philosophy kings.
Yes.
It's like, I think that might be a good idea. Have you read Oswald, The Decline of the West?
I have not. Is that good?
With what you were just saying about the cycles and I think you would like it.
Yeah, I need to get that one.
I think it would definitely go, and I read it about 6 years ago, but from what I remember, he talks about these cycles. In fact, it's kind of poetic the way he does it. He describes it as seasons, and every society does this, and he brings up a lot of what you're discussing here. And I think you would definitely like it. If I remember correctly, I really enjoyed it.
Well, I'll definitely read it, because it's funny enough, as trite and cliche and simple as it is, one of the things that started the whole Truths and the Rational series and all the philosophy work was just this very simple question that everyone asks: why does history repeat? To me, that was an incredibly profound question that didn't seem profound, that just seems simple, because it's like, wait a minute, history repeats, but everyone plans for history not to repeat. Everyone thinks at this time it won't. And they also think that they think that it won't, and they think therefore it's like an endless game theory thing, and yet it still does. So what must the nature of thinking be like to genuinely convince people that this time it's different when it never is, and they even know that they might be self-deceived, but self-deception is so deep that they're even deceived about self-deception? For me, that question basically shattered I was like, well, thinking must not work like we think it does. Like, that question just for me meant that it just meant that thinking didn't work like so that got me obsessed with, got me into all the epistemology, because I was like, well, if history repeats, then how we think thinking works must not be right.
That is I see you really would like Oswald. Because you'd make so many great connections with what he's because that's essentially the question he's asking as well. It's why does history repeat? Because the way we think can't be right. It can't be right. It has to be wrong, because we fall into those traps. See, I've thought my whenever thinking about that, because it's you're right. It's a very simple, almost cliche question. Well, those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it. It's like, well, no, who's repeating it are historians. I mean, that's a problem. Yes. But the thing is, and the question that I've always asked is, are we repeating history?
Sure.
We assume this because we look at certain basic outcomes and see that they're the same.
Sure.
But to repeat history, the process in which we had to reach those outcomes would also have to repeat.
Yes.
But is that also repeating?
Yes.
And you believe so?
Oh, well, for me, it gets into 1,000 interesting questions because there's a sense in which history can't repeat because it's like always one-on-one, and yet there's some formal repetition that repeats that's very strange. There's some sort of probability. So when we talk about like human nature, for example, like you have to be talking about like a probability. Like it is probable that human beings denied food for 72 hours will act X way, even though we can't know for sure that they will act X way. They may act Y way or Z way. So likewise, a civilization that has X number of success over Y period of time is probable to do Z. It's not definite, but there seems to be probabilities of which occur in certain circumstances. And yet those probabilities do not occur in perfect repetition. Also, you have cross currents between different forms. Like, for example, like economics and technology inform one another in unique ways that they never informed each other before, because you start getting AI technologies that can replace the worker entirely. So there's something repeating, but it's not merely repeating.
And that's what I guess its conclusions are repeating in ways that can be comparable, but I think say history or peace is simplifying it too much, because that's not what is repeating. And I think you're absolutely right in turning this into an epistemological problem, is something in the way we're thinking. And if you backtrack that to a point, it's, well, our way of thinking to begin with within that very question is a problem.
Exactly.
And when you so it's I think that is a really great place to well, I think it has to almost start there, because any society from its base points begins with ideology and these things that stem from thought. Well, if that's the case and it all ends in conclusion, then yes, there is a problem in the thinking.
Well, this is what's nuts. Exactly, because if the outcome, like we're saying, people are conflating the outcomes of history repeating with history precisely repeating.
Yes, and that's what I meant to say.
And when it could be the case that there's like 6 roads to that outcome, and once you get to that outcome, it makes it seem like it was all just a repetition, but really it's the formal outcome that's occurring.
Yes.
But then the question is, how is the mind able to do that? Like what are the ways that thinking occurs that it ends up at these outcomes from different ways, but then it strikes it as appearing to repeat? Because one of the problems is, if you think it totally repeats, and you think you're going to notice it when it's repeating, because you just have to look for the same thing occurring again. But what happens is there must be different roads to those different outcomes, and then you end up at the outcome, and then when you're there, it's like, well, it happened again. It's the same cycle of history.
And a great question to throw in that is the reason on why these outcomes are comparable simply because it is the only outcome?
Sure.
We could say, maybe the outcome actually happened before the comparable situation, and that outcome ran its course, and that small moment in time was the actual outcome of everything before it, but that outcome isn't eternal. And so the only other option is now whatever comes after. And so a conclusion to that will always actually just be naturally the same thing. No matter what conclusion you come to, that conclusion is also going to have to change.
That's right.
And so we say, well, history repeats, and then we kind of put these bookends and say, this was history, and here, this is where it began, this is where it ended, and start here. But no. Move the bookend a bit further, and actually maybe that is how it all ends. Well, no, you move it a bit further and you go, well, okay, now you're starting to see a pattern. Now, this pattern itself has no other option but to run in this course,
Yes.
because eventually, no matter if you were to come to a different conclusion, that conclusion then too comes to an end, and then you're back to whatever we say, okay, now here's the bookmark. And so really there is no possible other outcome.
Yes, yes. Well, and so the question becomes, like, how does the mind operate that it is thus? Because the mind is creating, the thinking is creating the free range, per se. It's not a hard determinism, but it's like cows in a field where they can move around, but they can't move everywhere. They have freedom, but they're in bounds, per se. So what are the tendencies that thinking imposes on itself to make the situation like you described? And to genuinely believe, and then thinking has to believe it's not doing that to itself, because if it knew it was doing that to itself, then it wouldn't end up at that outcome.
Yes, and then your question would be not so much how do we not repeat history, but how do we repeat history insofar and then be able to stop before we get to that other outcome which we know is coming next.
That's exactly right. And that's where the second book in Reconstructing A is going to be like Hegel's absolute knowing, because that's where you get the contingency of history, where there's a there's a formal similarity that occurs in history, but the outcome is contingent, but only if you realize it's contingent, like only if there's a certain absolute knowing that is an acknowledgement of limit that then makes it possible to control that limit or to do something about that limit, because you experience it as limitless, which is that weird paradoxical blending of humility and all that jazz. But to me, it also, as on a different scale, the question is similar to me to the question of why do no one gets married thinking they're going to get a divorce. In fact, people get married thinking this is the most wonderful person on planet Earth, generally speaking, and yet 50% of people get divorces. How is that possible? No one gets married planning to get a divorce. So how do divorces occur? Well, the mind must work in a manner that makes you end up in that situation without realizing it and genuinely believing you wouldn't realize it. So what are the factors for that? So it's like no one plans for history to repeat. And it doesn't, in a sense, but there are these outcomes that seem to be a recurrence. So why is that? How does the mind work?
Well, there's a kid. For some reason, I think this might be Camus' more what he may have meant by this very famous line. I'm about to say, we all take it as just this nice poetic little thing that Camus said, but maybe this is kind of more what he's pointing at when he says, I knew within me within the winter, I knew within me there was an inevitable summer. Is knowing that no matter what state you're in, you're only in that state due to the possibility of its negation.
Yes.
And we I mean, of course, there's and you understand things of what they are by what they're not, and this is a very well. I mean, it always goes back to Hegel, and everything does, but if you apply this to not just ideas and actions, but the two together, then you will then the only options do become, if you want to have a state in which you can say this is the outcome and this is where it ends, the negational has to remain as such. But you have to always be aware that there is that negation fighting back to what it is, and so the human mind is very much that is and the way we think, and if we're heading in one direction, we're only pushing back what everything else, and so with that, along with the progression of history, is doing just that. And so it's at one point when you start to push, you also have to keep an equalness is pushing the other way, and to just keep this kind of balance. And it's almost as if you have to meet. Instead of thinking progressively in that sense, you have to think from both ends constantly and just kind of almost try and condense it until it is what it is. almost in a very strange way, the whole Marxian concept of communism, just shrinking power till it's nothing. Well, do that if you can apply that to a way of thinking with the actions in which are committed. Well, maybe then there could be something there.
Oh, sure. And the thing with what you're saying there is, if I go back to David Hume, so one of the kind of concepts where he's always warning about autonomous rationality, where rationality becomes its own justification and so on and so forth. Basically, if we just use this phrase, history repeats, autonomous rationality that doesn't have any reference to anything outside of its own internal consistency must end up in those outcomes of history. And it must kind of have this compression effect where you end up there. If you are to avoid that, you must appeal to something outside of rationality, non-rationality, the communal, the artistic, he talks about the sympathy, which he ties with empathy, action, embeddedness in a common life is the big one for him. So basically, it's like the only way to keep history from quote unquote repeating is to escape autonomous rationality and to actually ascribe to something beyond autonomous rationality, because the nature of self-relating rationality is in fact to end up in these outcomes from some different angle. They don't totally repeat, but that's actually part of the problem. If they totally repeated, you may recognize them, but autonomous rationality can find a way to relate to itself that hides the fact that it's heading toward the same outcome. So then you end up there and you're screwed. So that actually would further suggest the necessity of the skill of artistic apprehension and artistic thinking, because those are non-rationalities that can help you escape autonomous rationality. And actually the whole book, The Fate of Beauty, which is kind of after The Truism of the Rational, is about basically how beauty stops history from repeating, basically because it's a way that it can pull you out of autonomous rationality by making rationality relate to something beyond itself, by making philosophy relate to literature per se. And that's actually but there has to be a philosophy there relating to literature, or literature becomes an autonomous thinking. You get kind of an autonomous non-rationality, which is just as problematic. So you have to have this dialectical action between the philosophical and the literary per se, or else you're going to get an autonomous system of one to the other that will self-relate to itself in a manner that makes the outcomes unescapable. You will fall into them again. If you are to escape these outcomes, then there has to be an acknowledgement of the limits of autonomous rationality, right? The realization that self-relating rationality ultimately ends up repeating these certain outcomes of history. That's to say rationality is limited. Well, that's absolute knowing, because absolute knowing is knowing the limits of thinking, of being, so on and so forth. Well, once you know that limit, well, then you know that limit and you know where it is. So you can open it and you can move it. And then you can open philosophy to literature. And now you don't have self-relating rationality. You have rationality that is relating to non-rationality. And I talk about beauty. So basically the fate of beauty is the fate of us, because without beauty and I think artistic apprehension is unique. Without that, which then is necessary for ontological alignment with what humans actually are, going back to Chesterton, without that, you are stuck in this autonomous rationality that will make it impossible to escape these repeating forms of outcomes of history. And that means totalitarianism. That means self-effacement. So the relation of philosophy and literature is basically, for me, getting that right, you couldn't have higher stakes. It's basically the highest stakes that you can have.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and that's where these academia, that's where the separation of philosophy and literature and academia is basically, doomed. It's basically doomed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And Professor Tatu, he was saying something similar. He gives it another 10 years before they're just not even things anymore. It's just and really all it takes is just one idea to replace it, and it'll be replaced almost overnight.
Hey, and that gets us back to one of the reasons I do believe in the YouTube stuff, because yeah, because it's like, I think YouTube is a new medium. I was saying, not just to be stupid. No, I shouldn't say stupid, but academic lectures on YouTube, but new ways to do philosophy, not just about philosophy. YouTube does. When people see that, once that really takes hold and people take it seriously, there you go. That's
the optimistic line right there. Once people take it seriously. That is optimistic, assuming people will take it seriously.
Well, this is where I then add my tragic point where, the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk, where maybe people will take it seriously because they won't have a choice, or they'll realize, oh crap, we didn't escape those outcomes of history. What did we do wrong? Oh, maybe we separated literature and philosophy. Oh, YouTube is where they're not doing that. Oh, we need to go there. Unfortunately, people start to take things seriously when things get serious. I would like to think it doesn't have to be that way, but that is an example of a way that history tends to repeat. It's just human nature that the majority of people will probably not take something seriously until it becomes serious. I wish it didn't have to be that case. One of the gains, one of the benefits of artistic skill is you actually learn to take things seriously before you have to. And when you don't have to, no one is forcing you to take literature and philosophy seriously. No one is. But you learn to take things seriously that no one else takes seriously. And guess what? The only way for society to avoid these repeating outcomes is for the whole society to do that. So the lack of that ability to take things seriously that no one forces you to take seriously is incredibly consequential for the social order. Because if the majority cannot do it, well, then history, quote unquote, repeats.
Yeah. Personally, I have no hope, but hey, I just hope to publish my novels and lock myself away and just study it and just know that if I ever get on a huge platform or there's thousands of people watching, I'll just repeat this conversation and then lock myself away and be like, now you guys know. Deal with it, but I don't want to deal with you people anymore.
Hey man, we live on a farm and have a garden and go down to the creek.
We just have books downstairs. That's the way to go, man.